very few of us, if any of us, have ever heard the name Wilson Jerriman. Wilson grew up in a poor family in the northeastern part of North Carolina. And some of you might can relate that his family was so poor that when he was growing up, when his shoes wore out, he had to take cardboard that he found in the trash can and put them as the new sole or new insert into his shoes. And so he would wear those for a long time. And he had to drop out of school. He finished 7th grade, and then he dropped out of school. He quit school so that he could help work a farm and support his family. And later life was a little bit better for him. He was able to get married and move his family to Georgetown. And he landed a job in Georgetown working for a catering company. And he was very diligent, and he had a great work ethic. And so he worked with some great folks there in Washington, and he had a friend that worked for the White House in Washington, D.C. And his friend was a butler in the White House, and he told him, he said, "Wilson, there's a job opening for a cleaner in the White House, and I know you're a hard worker. Would you be interested in this job?" And Wilson kind of thought about it for a moment. He was kind of hesitant to take this job, but eventually he said, "Yeah, I think that's something I'd be interested in. I'd be glad to do that." And so he took the job as a cleaner, and so he did his job. He went into the White House every single day. He cleaned his part very well, and so well that one of the first ladies noticed his work ethic. And it wasn't just his work ethic they noticed. They noticed that when he was cleaning and the kids were around, he would stop cleaning, he would play with the kids, but he didn't let that interfere with his work. He would make sure he would get his work done as well. And so this first lady kind of took notice of him, and she promoted him, made sure that he was promoted to a position of a butler, which comes with a pay raise and all that good stuff. And so Wilson Jerriman, he served in the role of a butler in the White House for over 50 years. Through 10 different presidents. He actually served 11 different presidents, but only in the role of butler for 10 of them. And he was so close with each of the first families that when he passed away this year, actually he passed away in May, several of the first families sent kind of condolences for him. Some of them even went on TV and kind of gave their story about him. And Jenna Bush Hager, she was talking on the Today Show, and as she was talking, she could barely hold back the tears talking about this man who was just a butler for everybody else. Talking about this man who was there every single day when she was a kid and she lived in the White House. And she said that he was a lovely man and that he was one of the reasons that the White House felt more like a home than a political arena. You see, when we think of the White House, we don't think of it as a home for a family and for kids, but this is what he did for these kids, these first kids. Michelle Obama agreed, and she said that with his kindness and care, Wilson Jerriman helped make the White House a home for decades of first families. His service to others, his willingness to go above and beyond for the country he served and for all those lives he touched is a legacy worthy of his generous spirit. His granddaughter was interviewed for an article about him after he died, and she said that he enjoyed his work. It was a tremendous blessing for him. But one thing that she found was odd was that he was probably privileged to some of the most powerful secret conversations in the world, and yet he refused to talk politics. He would never discuss politics outside of the White House. In fact, even in the White House, he would never discuss it. He would never see a president as a Republican or a Democrat. He never talked about a family as a Republican or a Democrat. He always referred to them just as the president and their family. You see, for him, he understood that his job was a joy and it was an honor to serve the President of the United States. And Mr. Jerriman embodies the spirit and grace of what it looks like to be a loyal servant, just to serve because you want to, not because of what you're getting out of it. And this morning we're going to continue looking at some of the heroes of the Old Testament. We've been walking through some of them, and this morning we're going to look at a lady. She starts off young but ends up a little older, a lady named Ruth. And she's going to give us a great example of what it looks like to be a loyal servant. In this first chapter of the book that bears her name is where we're going to be. So Ruth chapter 1. And she's going to teach us some great lessons about being a loyal servant. But I want us to kind of think deeper as we go through this. And so my prayer is that as we work through this story, and it's kind of a familiar story for some of us that grew up in church and some of us that have been in church for years. You may hear a passage that you heard at a wedding one time when you were at a wedding. But as we work through this passage, my goal is not so much that you think of being a servant to other people. That's part of this. But I really want us to connect this with our service to Christ. Are we a loyal servant to God, to Christ, like Ruth is to Naomi. And so with that, I want to go ahead and read her story, or part of her story. Starting in Ruth chapter 1, we'll start in verse 6, and we'll read down through verse 18. But verse 6 says, she and her daughters, Naomi and her daughter-in-laws, prepared to leave the land of Moab, because they had heard in Moab that the Lord had paid attention to his people's need by providing them food. She left the place where she had been living, accompanied by her 2 daughter-in-laws, and traveling along the road leading back to the land of Judah. And she said to them, each of you go back to your mother's home. May the Lord show faithful love to you as you have shown to the dead and to me. May the Lord enable each of you to find security in the house of your new husband. She kissed them, and they wept loudly. No, they said to her, we will go with you to your people. Verse 11, but Naomi replied, return home, my daughters. Why do you want to go with me? Am I able to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. Go on, for I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me to have a husband tonight and to bear sons, would you be willing to wait for them to grow up? Would you restrain yourself from remarrying? No, my daughters, my life is much too bitter for you to share, because the Lord's hand has turned against me. Again, they wept loudly. Ophel kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Naomi said, look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her God. Follow your sister-in-law. Verse 16, but Ruth replied, do not persuade me to leave you, or go back and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May Yahweh punish me and do so severely if anything but death separates you and me. And finally, verse 18, when Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped trying to persuade her. Let's pray together. Father, we thank you so much, God, that you are the God that turns graves into gardens. God, that you are the God that turns bones into armies, that you turn seas into highways. God, we are so thankful for all these amazing stories of the Old Testament that remind us, that give us a physical picture of what our faith should look like and what you're capable of in the New Testament, Father. God, I pray this morning that as we hear this story, as we work through this story, this is not just a story that we've heard thousands of times, God, that it's not just a story that we're familiar with. It's not just a story from thousands and thousands of years ago. God, I pray honestly that this is our challenge. God, that you challenge our hearts in this moment. God, that we are open to accept your challenge. God, that we will be loyal servants in the picture of what Ruth was to Naomi. God, not just to each other, not just to one another and our family and our friends, but God, ultimately to you. And so, God, I pray that as we work through this text, God, I pray that we are challenged. I pray that we are challenged not just to be servants, but God, to embody a loyal servant for you, Father. And so, God, I pray that with all honesty, you speak to us. God, I pray that our hearts are wide open to you, God, that if there is anything in this moment that is separating you from us, God, I pray that we are able to send it away. God, I pray that we're able to cast out any distraction that is here. And God, I pray that if there's anything in our lives that is separating you from us, that today be the day that we deal with that. God, whether it's sin in our life, whether it's just disobedience in our life, God, whether it's the calling that you placed on our life and yet we refuse to follow through with it, God, if there's anything that separates you from us and us from you, God, I pray this be the moment and this be the time that you show that to us, God, and that we be willing to take the courage and have the courage to remove that from our life. God, let us be your loyal, faithful servants. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. For many of you, you know that I grew up doing construction work, that my dad owned a drywall business. And so I started very young doing drywall work. In fact, it was probably illegal how young I started doing drywall work, but when your dad owns the company, you can get by with those kind of things. And so my dad taught me that there's really 2 different ways to hang sheetrock, to hang drywall on the wall, all right? The right way, according to my dad, and the only way my dad would ever let us do it, is that you measure off the piece that you're going to cut. And while someone's going to cut it, the other guy's standing there waiting, and he doesn't waste time. He takes a glue gun, and he puts glue on the studs, all right? So you take glue, you cover each one with, or you take the glue gun, cover each stud with glue, and that way when the guy comes back with a piece of sheetrock, you put it in place, you nail it around the corners, and then you put screws in. And really, honestly, at that point, the nails and the screws, they're really only there to hold that piece of sheetrock in place until the glue dries. And once the glue dries, the glue itself would be strong enough to hold the sheetrock. And so that was the way that my dad taught me to do sheetrock, to make sure that it was done right. And so you use the glue, you use the nails, you use the screws, and you did all that because that was the process to do it. But then there's this other way to do it, right? And the other way to do it is that you just skip the whole glue part altogether, right? That you just come in, you measure the piece of sheetrock you need, somebody else goes cuts it, you wait for them, they bring it back to you, and then as soon as they bring it back to you, you don't worry about the glue, you just start putting nails and screws in the wall. And to be honest with you, that's a much more convenient way to do it. I don't know if you've ever had to hang sheetrock with glue or work with a caulking gun, but if you're not using it, you don't have to worry about keeping up with it. You don't have to worry about it being in your way. Kind of the worst thing is that you don't have to worry about measuring or putting too much glue on a stud and it coming out and then it gets on your hands, and then it gets on your tools, and so you're having to wipe all this stuff off of it all the time. You don't have to worry about that if you don't use the glue in the first place. You don't have to worry about wasting time of putting glue on the studs. You don't have to worry about wasting time cutting the tops off the glue tubes and all those other tools that you have to do that. And honestly, if you don't use the glue, you save a whole lot of time. In fact, and the interesting thing is that for most people, when you walk into a house that is just finished hanging, that they've just finished it, or even when it's been finished, you usually can't tell by looking whether there's glue between those studs and the sheetrock or not. Right? Most people have no idea if there's glue holding that wall together or not. They just take for granted that there is. And the honest thing is that most people that got paid the same amount of money for doing that house, whether they used glue or they didn't use glue. So I want you to think about it for a moment. You've got two options. One, to use glue and get paid the same amount, or to not use glue and get paid the same amount and you get finished quicker. Right? And when it's 90 degrees like it has been the last few days, getting finished quicker sounds like a great idea. Right? And then if you need the money, that way you could finish early and then you could go start another job. Right? So there's a lot of people that took this idea, and so they decided that for them, it was easier just if they kind of took the easy route. If they took the easy way and they just didn't use the glue, they just didn't worry about it, they could finish this job, they could move on to the next one. And so for a lot of people, they took the easy way out so they can make a little more money. But my dad always told us that his best employees, the ones that lasted the longest, the ones that were most loyal to him and what he had taught them throughout the years, they weren't looking to take the easy way out. They're the ones that were making sure that it was done and was done right and it was going to be done for the long haul. See, without a doubt, the houses that don't have glue in them cause you to go back to them a whole lot more often. The nails start to pop out of the wall and you have more problems with the sheetrock shifting and changing and cracks in them and stuff like that. And so what the people at first didn't realize is, you can take the easy way out and you can put just a few nails and a few screws in there and you can make quick money that way, except when you have to come back another time. And a third time, and a fourth time. And eventually the quick money that you thought you made because you took the easy way out and didn't use the glue ends up costing you a whole lot more, because then you have to pay gas back every single time that you had to go back to that house. You see, we learned from a very young age that the quick and easy way to do something sometimes ends up costing you more than you thought it was. Sometimes it ends up missing out on the next house or the next opportunity because you got to go back to what you should have done right in the first place. And so really this is the first lesson that Ruth has to teach us, that loyal servants, they don't take the easy way out. They're not looking for the quick, easy answer out of their problems. You see, the opening verses of the book of Ruth, they introduce us to this man who lives in Israel, and he has a wife named Naomi. And you can go back and read those opening verses if you want to. I'm just going to kind of sum them up for you. But him and his wife him and his wife Naomi, they live in Judah and Israel during the same time as the Judges, and it tells us that there's a famine in the land. So they move to the land of Moab, which is just to the east of the Dead Sea. So basically they cross the Jordan River, they move over to the Dead Sea, or on the other side of the Dead Sea. And when they're in Moab, they have two sons, okay? Or maybe they had the two sons before they go to the land of Moab. We don't know exactly the time frame here. But while they're in the land of Moab, this man dies. So he leaves his wife, Naomi, with their two sons, okay? And that's all the family there is. That's the family unit that's there in the land of Moab. These two sons get married while they're in the land of Moab, and they get married to two Moabite women, two women from that native area. But eventually, after 10 years of being in that land, these two sons die. So now the family unit is Naomi and her two daughter-in-laws, Ophel and Ruth, right? And that's it. That's all that's left of this family. And so after losing her husband and both her sons, Naomi says, this is enough. I've had enough of the land of Moab. I've been here for a little over 10 years now, and it's been nothing but tragedy after tragedy for me. So she's also heard that the famine in the land of Israel is over, so she decides she's going to pack up and she's going home. I don't know how great things are in Israel or Judah at the time, but they can't be any worse than this, right? So she's going to pack up and go home. But in verse 8, she gives her two daughter-in-laws the easy way out, right? And so in verse 8, she looks at each of them. She says, each of you go back to your mother's house. May the Lord show faithful love to you as you have shown to the dead and to me. And so apparently in her eyes, Ophel and Ruth, they have been good wives to their sons. And they had a good relationship with her as a mother-in-law. And so much that she uses a very interesting word here, a word that we don't see very often in this kind of context. The word that we're talking about in this translation is that you have shown faithful love. She's asking God to show faithful love to them like they have shown to her and to the dead. Now, what makes this interesting, and if you have a different translation, it may say kindness or even mercy. And what makes it an interesting use here is this word is used over 250 times throughout the Old Testament, right? Just a little over 250 times. The vast majority of those 250 times, it is a relationship to God to people. This is how God treats people. God shows mercy to people. God shows kindness to people. And He doesn't because He doesn't owe them anything. They don't earn anything. He's just showing His kindness. He's showing them mercy. He's showing them grace, if you will. And so the vast majority of the time, it's a relationship between God and His people. God shows mercy. God shows kindness. God shows faithful love. In fact, out of those 250 times, only 4 times does it refer to a relationship between two people. And that's what she's saying here. That these two ladies have treated another person with the same kind of love and kindness that God has shown. So now she's asking God, show them the kind of love that they have shown to us. And so Naomi is acknowledging that Ophel and Ruth have treated her with kindness, that they have treated her with mercy that she didn't deserve. They have treated her with a faithful love, even though she didn't deserve it. And so she's very appreciative of that, but she wants to let them know that their obligation to her is finished. And she really gives them permission and really this blessing to go back to where they came from, to go back to their homeland. They've kind of started on this journey. They've left the area of Moab, maybe a few miles outside of where they were at. But instead of going back to Israel with her, she says, listen, you can go back. And I'm going to give you a blessing to do that. I'm going to ask God to bless you when you go back. In fact, the blessing continues in verse 9. She says, may the Lord enable each of you to find security in the house of your new husband. Listen, you've been kind and you've been gracious to me, but your obligation to me and to my family, it's over. You don't have to go any further with me. You can go back to your family, and when you do go back to your family, I'm praying that God is good to you. When you do go back to your family, I'm praying that God gives you another family, a new family. I'm praying that you remarry, and I'm praying that you find security and strength, and you find security there with your new husband and your new family. I'm praying that you have everything that you've lost here with me and beyond. And so we kind of have to ask this question, why is Naomi intrigued so much? Why is she pressing these two ladies to go back to their homeland? Shouldn't she kind of encourage them to come with her? Why is she impressing this to go back? Why is she giving this blessing? And simply because for her, she knows that going back to their mother's house versus moving to Israel, that one of them is a much easier choice for them. That for them, going back to their mother and their homeland is a much easier choice. I want you to think and put yourself in Ruth and Ophel's shoes for just a moment. You've just lost your spouse, and we don't know the time frame. We don't know how long it's been. But if you lost someone that you loved dearly, would you rather be in a place that you were surrounded by people you know, that friends could stop by, that your family who was still alive could come by and see you? Now, you got to understand, this is before the days of cell phones and Facebook and all the mass communication we have now. So if folks were going to have communication with you, they were going to write a letter that took weeks to get to you, or they were just going to come by your house, okay? So if you were in that situation where you lost the love of your life, you lost your spouse, would you rather be in a place where people can come and surround you and show you they love you? Or would you rather pack up and move to a different place where you know maybe one, maybe two other people if the other one agrees to go with you? a place that has a totally different language, a place that has a different culture, a place that folks can't just drop by. And even if they could drop by, they're probably not going to, because what you also need to know is that the Moabites and the Israelites, they're not friends at this point. Okay? They're not buddy-buddy. They're not allies with each other. They live across the sea from each other, a small sea. They can see each other across the sea, but they're not friends. So if you've lost the love of your life, would you rather be in a place that you're surrounded by people that you know and love and care for you, and you know they care for you, and you're used to things, you're used to the custom, or would you rather pack up in that moment of mourning, that moment of distress, and move to some place that is totally different, some place you don't speak the language, some place that the way of life is different, that it's a foreign land to you, and nothing makes sense in that moment? You see, the easy thing for them to do would be exactly what Naomi says. Just go back home. It's easier for you. Go back home because it's going to be easier for you. Go back home where things are familiar for you. Go back home where you've got this support system. You got people surrounding you that are loving you. And this is the easy thing to do. But that's not what these two ladies decide to do. After they weep and they cry together, both of them reply to Naomi in verse 10. They say, "No," they tell her. "We will go with you to your people." You see, a loyal servant doesn't take the easy way out. These ladies knew this was going to be a difficult transition. These ladies knew that it was going to be hard to pack up all their stuff. And I don't know if you've ever had to pack up and move. I don't know if you've ever had to move just across town or across to a different country. But it's not an easy thing. I've moved more times than I want to. And I would be fine if I never have to move ever again. Okay? And that was just an hour down the road. I hate moving. And so I couldn't imagine packing up my family and moving them to a land that we knew nothing about. Moving them to a land that my kids didn't speak the language. Moving them to a land that my kids didn't understand the customs. That was totally different for us. And that's what she's saying. I don't want you to have to do that. I just want you to stay here. You see, Ruth and Oprah, they knew this was going to be different. They knew that it was going to be difficult. They knew that this was not the easy way, but that's the point. They're willing to stick with Naomi even though they know the path is going to be difficult. For most of us, looking at our week ahead, we know that tomorrow is going to be different than today. Now, I understand that some of you are teachers, and so tomorrow may not look that much different for you. So if you're a teacher, I want you to fast forward a little bit to August 17th. And suddenly just panic struck in your mind when I said that, all right? For you guys that are teachers or for you guys that are students, August 17th is going to look a whole lot different than August 16th did, okay? For many of you sitting here, tomorrow morning is going to look different than it was this morning, because tomorrow morning you're going to have to get up maybe a little earlier than you did this morning, and you're going to have to get dressed, and you're going to have to go to work. And once you're there, you're going to spend between 8 and 12 hours, depending on your work day, doing something. You might be sitting at a computer the whole time. You might be out working in a field the whole time. You might be building trucks or doing something, but you're going to do something for those number of hours between 8 and 12. You're going to be doing a lot of different things. And most of us, let's be honest, most of us are willing to do all that, not because we like it, but because we know that at the end of the week or at the end of the month, somebody is going to give us a paycheck and pay us back for what we've been doing all week or all month long. All right? For most of us, whether we work for Freightliner or Duke or Piedmont Natural Gas or the government or the school system or some contractor, most of us, we work for those people. We have this expectation that we've done all this stuff all week or all month long, however it is you get paid. But we're going to do that with this expectation that at the end of this, I'm going to get a paycheck. I'm going to get repaid for my time and my energy and my effort. And so my guess is, and maybe I'm wrong, I know people say they love their job. I know people say that they don't love their job, but they like their job, okay? I understand that. But my guess is, my honest guess is, that if you showed up tomorrow morning for work, and your boss, whoever it is, looked at you and said, by the way, those doors are going to be open for you for the next week, for the next month, but you need to know at the end of the week there's no paycheck coming for you. You need to know that at the end of the month, there's no paycheck coming for you. I wonder how many of us would show up for work tomorrow morning, have that conversation with our boss. Honestly, I wonder how many of us would finish that conversation with our boss, all right? I was going to say would come back the next day to spend time with him, but my guess is that most of us wouldn't even finish that day. Right? My guess is that if we didn't expect some type of payment for what we would do, we wouldn't show up for work just to hang out and spend time with our boss. And regardless of how nice your boss is, we're probably not going to do that. You see, there's a difference between being an employee and working with this expectation of being repaid and being a servant who doesn't expect repayment for what you do or the time that you put in. You see, the next lesson that Ruth teaches us about being this loyal servant is that loyal servants are committed to serving, and they don't expect to get something in return. They don't expect to be repaid for what they do or what they give. You see, Naomi loves these two ladies, and she wants to put them in the best place she can. She doesn't want to put them through any more heartache. She doesn't want life to be any more difficult for them than it already has. She's trying to get them to go back to their mother into the land of Moab, and she's going back to the land of Israel. And she's really trying everything she can to get them to go back home, to go the easy way. And they're refusing. And so she gives them this blessing. She dismisses them, but that doesn't work. So she tries this different tactic. And starting in verse 11, she changes her tactic to, hey, I'm going to bless you. Your obligations are over. You go do this. In verse 11, she shifts it around a little bit to this logical reason that you need to go back. Right? In verse 11, as she starts off, she says, return home, my daughters. I want you to notice this term of affection here. She doesn't just, you guys go home. I'm done with you. She calls them daughters, right? Let you know her relationship with them. This is a term of endearment. She loves them. She's not trying to get rid of them, but she's trying to make life easier for them. And she says, return home, my daughters. Why do you want to go with me? Am I able to have more sons who you could become, or who could become your husbands? And she's referring to a Jewish tradition and really a Jewish law. If you take notes, you can just jot this down. Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 5, right? So Deuteronomy 25, verse 5. We're not going to read the whole passage or that whole verse, but it basically comes down to this, that if a man is married and he dies before he has a son, before he has an heir to pass on his name, then his younger brother, or his brother, whether it's younger or older, really, his brother has to marry his wife and help her produce a child. And that child, technically, by the law, is the child of the husband who died. So that way, that child carries on the family name. He carries on that family line. Right? So that way, a family name and a family line doesn't die with that son or with that man who died. And so this is the way the family line kept going. Now, we as Christians, we're not bound to that law by any means, but I can tell you that when Malachi, my son, was born, my wife breathed a great sigh of relief. All right? And I've talked about my brother, and she was really nervous about having to marry my brother until we had our son. And I can tell you that's just a relationship that would have never worked. And I'm kidding. But in those days, that's how it worked. So when these two sons died, Naomi's next son would have had to marry the first daughter-in-law, and then her next son would have had to marry the second daughter-in-law, okay? And that's the way it worked. But the problem is that Naomi doesn't have any more kids. She is out of sons to pass on to these two ladies. So these sons, their family line, is ended. And Naomi's making it clear that, listen, I don't have any more kids for you to marry. In fact, she goes on in verse 12, and she takes it a step further, and she tells them again, return home, my daughters, go on, for I'm too old to have another husband. Listen, I'm old, and I ain't got time to get on the dating apps, and I ain't got time to go to the clubs and the speed. I ain't got time for all that. I'm too old for all that. And it just bothers me that nobody would want to even marry me if I was. I'm just an old widow, and I'm fine with that. And because they're good daughter-in-laws, they're not going to be like, you're right, Naomi, you are old. You're right, your days are done. No, they're good daughter-in-laws, so what are they going to be like? No, girl, you still got game? You can get back in the field. Come on, you got this. And so she kind of squelches this argument anymore. She kind of puts an end to it, and she goes on in verse 12 and verse 13. She says, let's just think about this. I'm too old to find a man, but even if I thought there was still hope for me to have a husband tonight and to bear sons. So let's just suppose that there was some miracle. That right now, Mr. Wright, in this morning, just fell out of the sky. We drove to Vegas through the drive-through wedding chapel. We got married, and we got pregnant tonight. Right? Let's just suppose that all these miracles fit in perfectly, and I got pregnant tonight. All that happened tonight. And verse 13 is a real eye-opening question for these two ladies. Right? Suppose all this miracle happens. In verse 13, would you be willing to wait for them to grow up? Would you restrain yourself for remarrying? So let's just say that this miracle happened and everything happened just perfectly tonight. Would you be willing, honestly willing, to wait 16 or more years for them to have a new son, for them to get to the age that you could marry them? Right? Would you really want to wait that long? That's a long time for you to have to wait. And I want you to think about it logically for a moment. What she's really saying is, if you waited for me to have another son, let's say this miracle happens, let's say that God just works everything. Let's say that I do have another son, and you wait 16 years. You realize that at that point, you're almost too old to have kids. Your life is almost over at that point. And so what she's really making him trying to understand is listen, I have nothing to offer you. There is no other sons. There's no hope for another son. There is nothing left for me to give you. And so we might you have a chance if you'll go back with your families and you can remarry someone, you can have the family and you can grow old with that family. Go do that because I have nothing left for you. I have nothing. And I want you to understand that if you go back with me, there's no chance of repayment. If you go back with me, there's no paycheck waiting for you at the end of the month. There is nothing left for me to offer you, neither now nor in the future. And Ruth, being a loyal servant, she agrees to go with Naomi, even though Naomi has nothing left. Even though Naomi can't make her any promises. Even though Naomi cannot repay her, Ruth is going to invest time, energy, and really the rest of her life to be with Naomi. And she expects nothing, absolutely nothing in return. She doesn't expect another husband. There's no hope for that. She doesn't expect an inheritance because there is none of that. She goes with Naomi, she serves with Naomi simply because she wants to. Not because she's going to get anything out of it for herself. And this is where Ruth's life becomes a great challenge for all of us sitting here and watching online. This is where we have to kind of have this retrospect. Are we willing to serve without any expectation of repayment? Are we willing to do for others and absolutely expect nothing in return? But let's take it a little step further. I want to start it off by telling you, I'm challenging you, this is not just relationship with other people, but let's talk about a relationship with God for just a moment. Are we really willing to serve God with zero expectation of repayment? Are we really willing to give everything that we've got to God if He had nothing to promise us in return? You see, there's lots of us who are willing to pray because we think our prayers will be answered. There's lots of us that are willing to read our Bible and have quiet time. But let's be honest, sometimes it's not about spending time with God. Sometimes it's about finding out what God will do for me and can do for me. You see, sometimes we do the same thing to come to church. We'll come to church and we'll watch online because deep inside us, we wouldn't say this out loud, but we feel like that we're kind of banking this a bank account, that we're building up this deposits in our spiritual life, that if I come to church, if I have this quiet time, if I say these prayers, then God's going to owe me something. And so if we're not careful, all these Christian things that we do become a way that we try to manipulate God into doing what we want Him to do and doing something for us. And the question really becomes, are we really willing to do those things if there was no expectation of a repayment? I wonder if we were willing to do what Ruth does for Naomi without any benefit of it whatsoever. She goes with Naomi not for the benefits, but she goes with Naomi just to be with Naomi. And I wonder how many of us would spend time with God, not for the benefits, not for the bank account that we think we're building up, but I wonder how many of us would spend time with God just to spend time with Him. Let's take it to church. How many of us would spend time in church? How many of us would honestly come to church, would watch online just to spend time with Him? If there was no expectation with repayment whatsoever, how many of us would do what we're doing, not for the benefits, but just to be with Him because we love Him that much? This is where the challenge of Ruth comes in. And I don't know if you've ever had to move away from your family or people that you love. And for many people, it can be a really emotional time. And I can't tell you the number of parents that I've talked to doing youth ministry that took their kids to college for the first week and took their kids to the college for their first time. And I always ask them when they get back, I'm like, how'd it go? And some of them are honest. They're like, we cried the whole way back. I cried before I ever got there, some of them will say. All right? And it's an emotional time when you have to leave someone that you love. It's an emotional time when you have to drop your kids off. And it's emotion because you love these people so much. And these ladies, they're no exception to this. This is a very emotional time for them. 2 times in the short passage I read, both in verse 9 and again in verse 14, it says they wept loudly. And I want you to see, because until verse 14, Ophel and Ruth, They've been together in everything that they've done. Their actions and their responses have been together. But in verse 14, we start to see this difference in Ruth as a loyal servant and the other one who's willing to walk away. We see this real difference between the two is that Ruth not only says she loves Naomi, she demonstrates that she loves Naomi through not just her words, but her actions. You see, until verse 14, everything with these two ladies have been the same. But in verse 14, that changes. Verse 14 starts off with, again, they wept loudly. And Ophel kissed her mother-in-law. But, it's a contrast. There's something different. Ruth clung to her. They are all in this same emotional thing. They're all feeling the same thing about this same moment. Ophel kisses Naomi, and then she walks away from her. She turns east and goes back to Moab, where Ruth doesn't do that. Ruth clings to Naomi. Ruth is not willing to let her go. Ophel says she loves Naomi, but she turns and walks away from her. Ruth says she loves Naomi, and she demonstrates it because she's going to hold on to Naomi. She's going to cling to her. She's going to hold on to her, and she's not willing to go any other way than where she's going. David Gusick, a great commentator, writes this. He says, there comes a place in our following after God where it comes down to our doing. Ruth and Ophel both felt the same feelings about Naomi, but Ruth did something different. He goes on to say that some are content with feeling Christian feelings, with feeling a love for God, with feeling a love for His Word, with feeling a love for His people. But the real question is, what are we doing with those feelings? And can people realize that there's a difference between what we say and what we're doing? Can people see that not just we say that we love God, but we actually demonstrate that we love Him because we are clinging to Him regardless of what else happens? And one thing that we've got to say, it's one thing that we can say that we love Christ, but a loyal servant knows that it's more than just saying it, it's demonstrating it through your actions so that anybody that's around you knows that you are clinging to Christ beyond anything else. You don't just say it, you don't just post it on Facebook, but you actually live it out. Jeff Goins is a writer, and he helps people kind of see how their work can be successful and how they can enjoy work regardless of what it is. And this past week, I stumbled on an article that he wrote, and he writes about these things he calls the 3 levels of commitment. And he calls the first level the adventure level of commitment. He says this is the level that most people go to. This is the level where you are going into a commitment because there's a thrill in this commitment. Because there's something exciting going on and you want to jump on board and you're along for the ride, but your commitment level to the idea or to the cause, it lasts only as long as the thrill does. And when the thrill is off and wears off, then you're getting off. And so wherever the train's at, when the thrill dies, you jump off that train and you sit at the station and wait for the next train because that one's thrilling as well. And so then you jump on that train. He says that's the first level. It's the adventure thrilling. It's the adventure level of commitment. So you're willing to do something because it feels exciting. And then he says there's a second level of commitment. And he calls this the seasonal commitment. And he gives this great analogy of a garden. He says that when you have a garden, you work the soil and then you plant the seeds and you weed the garden. You do all this work for a garden, but you only do it for a season. Because when the vegetables come in, when the harvest is done, you don't go back and weed the garden anymore. I want you to think about it for a moment. How many of you are as dedicated to your garden in December and January as you were in March and April and May and June? Very few of us. We have this seasonal level of commitment that we're in this thing for a certain amount of time or until a certain level is reached. And once that level is reached or that time is expired, we're done with it. We're not committed to it anymore. We don't have to be. And so we can walk away from it at that point. When the vegetables come in, when the harvest comes in, we can walk away from our garden. We're willing to do all this hard work, all this sweat and all this agony that goes into getting the garden right and weeding it and make sure everything. We're willing to do all that because we know we're only going to have to do it for this amount of time. And after this time is up, we are done. Our level of commitment is finished when the season is finished. But he says there's this final level of commitment, and he figuratively calls this the marriage level. He says it's not literal. He's just figuratively using that as a word. And he says this is the commitment that lasts forever. This is the commitment that says that I'm here for the long term. I'm fully committed to this for a long term. I'm not putting a season on it. I'm not putting an end on it. I'm not putting a condition on it. I am here for everything. For all of it. And so Ruth makes it clear that a loyal servant, this is the type of commitment that she's in. This is the type of commitment she's making to Naomi. She is fully committed for the long term. That she's not going with Naomi because there's a thrill in it. She's not going with Naomi because there's a certain number of years that she's going to stay here until Naomi gets on her feet. No, she's in this for the long term. And she makes that very clear in these two very famous verses, verse 16 and verse 17. Verse 16, Ruth says, "Do not persuade me to leave you or to go back and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go. And wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." Don't try to change my mind, Naomi. My mind is set. If you go back to Israel, I'm going with you. If you go back to this area that I don't know the people, I'm going with you. If you're going back to this place that I know nothing about, I'm going with you because I am fully committed to you. And I'm not just going back for a little while. I'm going back for good. Verse 17, she makes that clear that this is not a venture, this is not a seasonal, this is a long-term commitment. Verse 17, this is probably the verse that you heard at a wedding, and you may not have known that it was actually a daughter-in-law telling her mother-in-law this at the time. Verse 17 says, "Where you die, I will die, and where you will be buried, and there I will be buried. May Yahweh punish me and do so severely if anything but death separates you and me. I am in this. I am going with you. I am fully committed to you until we are both dead. And there is no going back for me. There is no plan B. I am never going back to the land of Moab. And when I make this commitment to you, I am there. And if you die in the land of Israel, that's where I'm going to be buried too." And so this is where this becomes, again, a challenge for us, not necessarily with each other and serving each other, but this is where a huge challenge comes us with this statement that she makes. Where you go, I will go. And where your people are, that'll be my people. And so the real question for us and the challenge that's before all of us is, could we make those same statements, not with each other, but with the God that we say that we're a servant of? God, I'm going wherever you lead me. God, I know it's going to be difficult. I know it's going to be different. I know things are going to be hard for me. I know there's going to be challenges for me. But God, I'm willing to do anything. I'm willing to change anything you want. God, I'm willing to adjust anything because I'm fully committed to you. God, if you call me to a different nation, I'll go. God, if you call me to a different job, I'll pack up and I'll leave this one tomorrow. God, if you even call me to a different set of people, a different set of friends, I'll leave these behind. Because I'm that committed to you. And not just for a season, not just for an adventure, but I'm fully in this. Wherever you lead me, I will go. God, wherever you are, that's where I want to be. And if you lead me here, I want to go there. If you lead me there, I want to go there. God, I don't know what it looks like. I don't know what the people look like. I don't know what to expect. I just know I want to be where you're at. And I want you to be the lead, and I will follow you. And so, God, I am praying right now, honestly, that there is nothing that separates me from you. God, I don't want to be in my comfort zone anymore. I don't want to be in this bubble that I feel comfortable and secure in anymore if you're calling me somewhere else. See, the real question in the life of Ruth is not necessarily her commitment to Naomi. It's her commitment to this God. And your God will be my God. And I trust your God so much that I'm even going to ask him to punish me if I don't follow through with this commitment that I've made. Are we willing to make that same commitment, not with each other, but with this God that we say that we serve? Are we willing to say that we are loyal servants to the God, and we are praying honestly that nothing will separate him from us? Let's pray together.